Paul McCartney, a leading member of the famous music band The Beatles, has had a very complex relationship with both fellow band member John Lennon and, very interestingly, his ex-wife Cynthia. From being one of the only members of the Beatles who visited and actively supported Cynthia after her messy divorce with John to even bringing her a rose a lot has been speculated about the two's relationship. Or were Cynthia and Paul just really great friends who deeply cared for each other, or was there something more intimate between them that we just don't know about? More importantly, how did Paul's relationship with Cynthia impact his professional communication and friendship with John? Was this a possible cause of conflict between the two, something that contributed to the eventual downfall of the Beatles? It's time to find out the answers to all these questions. But before we do that, you need to understand some complex relationship dynamics, because all three names involved in this case have an extraordinary and unique relationship with each person. John and Cynthia are an ex-couple. John and Paul were best friends until their friendship eventually turned sour, and Cynthia and Paul have a complex relationship we need to do some digging here and there to give a name to. In 1962, just around the time when the Beatles were rising in popularity, John and Cynthia got married. The two had a son and remained together until 1968. After their divorce, Cynthia stayed in the UK with their son Julian, while John quickly remarried and enjoyed a honeymoon with his new wife Yoko Ono, who John described as a person who was aggressive enough to save him from the boredom of his marriage with Cynthia Lennon. These are some bold and questionable statements to make in public about someone you previously loved and had a child with, but as we will later discuss, this still doesn't qualify as one of the most controversial things John has done. In her memoir titled John, Cynthia detailed the months after the divorce and how it changed her relationship with other members of the Beatles. She puts a lot of emphasis on Paul, who she described as being the only member of the Beatles family with enough courage to defy John, who had otherwise made it very clear that he expected everyone to cut her off. In this memoir, Cynthia also described Paul as his own man and as someone who wasn't afraid of John. Right off the bat, we can tell that there is something very different and beautiful about the bond Cynthia and Paul shared, and it's definitely not the same as her relationship with other band members. If all this wasn't enough, Cynthia also talked in detail about how Paul was the only one who came to check up on her and her son Julian Lennon. He arrived at her house one sunny afternoon with a red rose in his hand and even apologized to her, explaining just how sorry he was about the divorce and that what John did was not the right thing. Paul also wrote a heart-touching song for Julian titled Hey Jules, which was later changed to Hey Jude. These are some of my favorite sentences from the entire piece because they show that Paul truly wanted to be there for little Julian and support him in any way he could. And anytime you feel the pain, Hey Jude refrain. Don't carry the world upon your shoulders, for well you know that it's a fool who plays it cool by making his world a little colder. In very little time, Hey Jude was released as a single and became one of the Beatles' most popular songs. Today it holds over 480 million Spotify plays. Remember that I mentioned earlier how John has done a lot of controversial things during his career? I think right now is a good time to help you understand what I really mean by this. In March 1966, John Lennon casually boasted that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus, and as you can imagine, this hurt a lot of people's sentiments. Maybe not in the UK, but in the US, people got really upset. There was an insane amount of public uproar. Newspapers and magazines harshly criticized the band, and members even got death threats. Eventually, John was left with no other option but to humble himself and apologize to the public for his poorly calculated choice of words. And while we are on this topic, we can't miss out on John's frequent clashes with Paul, who was during the early days of the Beatles a very close friend. Small conflicts were common between them, but it was in 1967 that something big happened to the Beatles. This was the year when the friendship between John and Paul started to, in a very literal sense, fall apart. In May, they released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which many people like Kurt Loder from Rolling Stone say is one of the Beatles' best albums. It's the perfect music for the summer of love in 1967 and is closely connected to the rebellious spirit of the 60s. Regardless of its success, what we can't ignore is that Sgt. Pepper marked a turning point in John and Paul's friendship. It was around this time that their interest really started to differ, causing a power struggle between them that was easily picked on by people around, let it be colleagues, friends, or even their fans and critics. So you can say at this point things were starting to come under public scrutiny. The album was mainly Paul's idea as he was taking on a bigger role in the group while John was going through a tough time in his personal life. He later mentioned that he was still feeling down during the making of Sgt. Pepper while Paul was full of confidence. Next, the two had a public row when Paul announced that the Beatles were breaking up. This announcement made a lot of people upset and John was one of them. One of the main reasons why he was so angry was because he felt that the announcement made it seem like Paul was the leader of the band. Paul wanted everyone to know that he was the one who started the band and also the one who decided to end it. He also made it clear that he had kept quiet about the breakup so that the band could release more music in the future. As you can imagine, this made John feel insignificant, like his say didn't exactly matter, and we know for most people, including John, this would be a very hard pill to swallow. Now, if you think the clashes between the two end here as the Beatles came to an end, couldn't be more wrong, because in 1971 there was another major issue that occurred between Paul and John, not just in the media but also in their music. Paul released an album called Ram, which included a song called Too Many People, and John ended up interpreting it as a jab at him and his wife Yoko Ono. In response, John released a song called How Do You Sleep, which included some very harsh lyrics and also made a reference to the rumor that Paul had died and been replaced by someone else. It's also interesting to note that even after the Beatles broke apart, many band members continued to work together with each other, but we never saw John and Paul do the same. It's not too hard to guess why. Enough of John and Paul. Now let's go back to Paul and John's ex-wife Cynthia and discuss more of the controversies surrounding their weird relationship. In 2024, a viral social media story claimed that Paul bought letters written by John to Cynthia after their divorce and returned them to her with a note telling her not to sell her memories. While this story contains some truth, many details are either incorrect or unproven. The claim originated in various forms over the years and gained a lot of popularity in May 2024, spreading across platforms like Facebook, X, and LinkedIn. The most popular version of the story suggested that Paul bought multiple letters just days after Cynthia sold them and included a heartfelt note. This version was widely shared, with one Facebook post alone having over 140,000 reactions and 31,000 shares. However, the true story is much more complex. Cynthia did sell several letters from John after their 1968 divorce. Paul did purchase one of these letters, framed it, and returned it to her. But this event took place over several years, not just days after the sale. Moreover, there is no evidence that Paul included a note advising her not to sell her memories. Cynthia also mentioned this in her memoir John, where she expressed gratitude for Paul's thoughtful gesture of returning the framed letter. She appreciated Paul's kindness to both her and Julian. What do you think? Were Paul's actions coming from a place of friendship and sincerity for a friend's ex-wife, or were there more strings attached than we know of? Make sure to let us know in the comments below.